In the early hours of April 15th, 1912, a lifeboat drifted on the North Atlantic with room for 65 people and only about 24 aboard. The man at the tiller refused to row back for survivors. So a 44-year-old woman from Hannibal, Missouri, stood up, grabbed an oar, and told him that if he did not move, she would throw him into the sea. Denver's finest families had spent nearly 2 decades telling Margaret Tobin Brown she did not belong. That night, the defiance they had punished saved lives. This is the story of the woman they could not sink. Chapter 1. The Poorest Girl in Mark Twain's Town. Before the world called her unsinkable, Margaret Tobin stripped tobacco leaves for pennies in the town Mark Twain made famous. She was born on July 18th, 1867, in Hannibal, Missouri, in a small cottage in an Irish immigrant neighborhood near the Mississippi River. 2 years earlier, the Civil War had ended. The country was remaking itself, and Hannibal was a working river town of steamboats, lumber yards, and factory whistles. Twain had already left. His legend would soon turn the town into a postcard. For the Tobin family, it was simply a place to survive. Her parents, John Tobin and Johanna Collins Tobin, had each been widowed before they found each other. Each brought a daughter to the marriage, and together they raised 6 children in a house that never had enough of anything. John worked at the Hannibal gasworks, shoveling and hauling for a labourer's wage. But the Tobins were not defeated people. They were readers. They were believers in abolition, in fairness, and in education for daughters as well as sons. Margaret studied at a school run by her aunt, Mary O'Leary, and the habit of learning never left her. It could not last. At about 13 years old, Margaret left the classroom for Garth's tobacco factory, where girls stood for long shifts, stripping leaves until their fingers stained brown. This was ordinary in 1880. American children worked in factories, mines, and mills by the hundreds of thousands, and a gasworker's daughter had no obvious way out. The law offered her almost nothing. In much of America, a married woman's wages and property still belonged legally to her husband. A girl like Margaret Tobin was expected to work, marry, and disappear into a household. She watched the riverboats instead. Hannibal sat on the great highway of the Mississippi, and everything about the town pointed somewhere else. Out west, in the Colorado mountains, silver strikes were minting new millionaires by the month. Her brother Daniel went ahead to a boom town called Leadville, 2 miles up in the thin air of the Rockies, where ore came out of the ground and fortunes changed hands overnight. Around 1886, at about 18 years of age, Margaret packed what little she had and followed him. She would say later, with the bluntness that became her signature, that she had wanted money. She wanted to be rich enough to take care of her father, to buy back the years he had spent shoveling coal. It was not a daydream. It was a plan. But the first thing Leadville handed her was not a fortune. It was a choice that would shape every chapter that followed. Chapter 2. A Marriage with No Money in It. She went to Leadville planning to marry a rich man, and then fell in love with a poor one instead. Leadville in 1886 was one of the strangest cities in America, a silver metropolis above 10,000 feet, where millionaires and starving miners passed each other on the same frozen streets. Margaret found work in the carpet and drapery department of the Daniels, Fisher and Smith dry goods store, sewing and selling to women whose husbands had struck it rich. She saw every day exactly what money could buy. Then came James Joseph Brown. JJ was 31, the son of Irish immigrants from Pennsylvania, a self-taught mining man who had worked his way up from the shafts toward management. He was clever, ambitious, and respected. He was also not rich. Margaret admitted the struggle openly in later years. She had come west for a fortune, and marrying JJ meant giving up the plan. She decided, in her own words, that she would rather be poor with a man she loved than rich with one she did not. On September 1st, 1886, at the Church of the Annunciation in Leadville, 19-year-old Margaret Tobin became Mrs. J.J. Brown. The newlyweds lived in a small cabin out near the mines, far from anything resembling comfort. Their son Lawrence was born in 1887, and their daughter Helen followed in 1889. And here, in the years when she had nothing, Margaret showed who she actually was. She did not wait for wealth to begin her public life. She worked in soup kitchens that fed the families of injured and unemployed miners. She saw what happened to women when a husband died in a cave-in and the company owed them nothing. She also joined something larger. Colorado, in the early 1890s, was alive with the campaign for women's suffrage, and Margaret threw herself into it. Remember the timing. Almost nowhere on earth could women vote. The idea was treated as radical, even dangerous. Yet in the mining camps, where women ran boarding houses and buried husbands and held communities together, the argument made plain sense. Margaret Tobin Brown, a clerk's wife in a two-room cabin, was learning the mechanics of organizing: meetings, petitions, money, and pressure. Then the bottom fell out of everything. In 1893, a financial panic swept the United States, and Congress repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the law that had propped up the price of silver. Leadville was a silver town. Within months, mines closed across the district, thousands of miners lost their jobs, and the city that had glittered above the clouds began to starve. The Browns' future, like everyone else's, now depended on finding something in the ground that was not silver. J.J. believed he knew where to look. What he did next would change their lives in a single season. Chapter 3. The Gold Strike That Bought a Mansion. In 1893, Leadville was starving, and the Browns' escape came from bales of hay at the bottom of a mine. J.J. Brown was by then a superintendent for the Ibex Mining Company, and the company's hopes rested on a property called the Little Jonny mine. Everyone believed there was gold down there. The problem was getting to it. The shaft kept collapsing into a soup of unstable dolomite sand that poured in faster than men could dig. Other engineers had given up on ground like this. J.J. tried something almost absurd in its simplicity. He ordered the shaft lined with timbers and bales of hay, packing the walls so the sand pressed against the bales and held. The method worked. The diggers went deeper, the ground held, and the Little Jonny reached a body of gold ore so rich that hardened mining men struggled to describe it. In October 1893, the mine began shipping, and reports soon described 135 tons of ore moving out per day. Newspapers called it one of the greatest gold strikes in Colorado history. In a state ruined by the death of silver, the Browns had found gold. The Ibex board knew exactly whom to thank. They awarded J.J. 12,500 shares of company stock and a seat on the board of directors. Practically overnight, a couple who had started married life in a cabin near the shafts were millionaires. Consider the distance Margaret had travelled. 13 years earlier, she had been stripping tobacco leaves in Hannibal for pennies a day. Now her husband sat on the board of one of the richest gold producers in the Rockies, and the money flowing toward them was beyond anything her father had earned in a lifetime at the gasworks. They did what new Western fortunes did. They went to Denver. In 1894, the Browns paid $30,000 for a handsome stone-fronted house at 1340 Pennsylvania Street, in the Capitol Hill neighborhood where the city's elite lived. It had been designed by the architect William Lang, with stained glass and carved wood and a retaining wall of rough stone. They added a country retreat called Avoca Lodge, southwest of the city. Margaret filled the house with books, art, and visitors, and set about the business she had been preparing for her whole life, becoming someone. She had the fortune. She had the mansion on the right street. She had a husband whose name commanded respect in every mining exchange in the West. By every rule the Gilded Age claimed to live by, the doors of Denver society should have swung open. Margaret Brown was about to learn that the rules were written by someone else, and that 36 chairs in one woman's parlor could be defended like a fortress. Chapter 4. The 36 Doors That Stayed Shut. Margaret Brown had the mansion, the fortune, and the gowns, and Denver's inner circle still refused to let her in. The gatekeeper had a name. Louise Hill was a Tennessee-born bride who had married into one of Denver's great smelting fortunes, and she had appointed herself the arbiter of who mattered in the city. Her chosen circle became known as the Sacred 36, supposedly the number of guests who fit at the bridge tables in her home. 36 seats for a city of more than 100,000 people. Everyone else was outside. Margaret was everything the Sacred 36 was built to exclude. She was new money in a town where the old money was barely 20 years old itself. She was Irish at a time when Irish need not apply was still printed in newspapers. She was Catholic in a Protestant establishment. She was loud where the rules demanded quiet, educated by ambition rather than by finishing school, and married to a man who had worked underground with his hands. The invitations that mattered did not come. The stories say her parties were snubbed, and her name was kept off the lists that defined who existed in Denver. Here the record deserves honesty. Modern historians, led by her biographer Kristen Iverson, have shown that the picture of Margaret as a total outcast was exaggerated by the mythmakers who came later. She was not shunned by the whole city. She appeared in the society pages, joined civic organizations, and counted prominent Denver families among her friends. But the innermost circle, the Hill Circle, the 36 seats, held the line against her for years. The exclusion was real. It was simply narrower and therefore more pointed. A specific set of doors, closed by a specific woman. Think about what that exclusion was actually worth defending. In the 1890s, society was not entertainment. It was infrastructure. The right guest lists decided whose daughters married whose sons, whose husbands got into which deals, whose causes received money, and whose reputations survived a scandal. A woman like Louise Hill, who could not vote and could not sit on a board, wielded real power through those lists, and she knew it. Keeping Margaret Brown out was not pettiness. It was policy. Most women in Margaret's position chose one of two paths. They begged, remodeling themselves year after year, hoping to be forgiven for their origins. Or they retreated, accepting that the doors would never open. Margaret Tobin Brown, the girl who had crossed half a continent on a plan, looked at the 36 chairs she would never sit in and made a different calculation entirely. If Denver would not seat her at its table, she would build a bigger one, and she would fill it with people who actually did things. Chapter 5. She built a society of her own. If Denver would not give her a seat, Margaret Brown would build the table and fill it with reformers. In 1894, the same year she moved into the Pennsylvania Street House, she joined the Denver Women's Club. To modern ears, that sounds like tea and gossip. In the 1890s, it was something closer to a shadow government. Across America, women who could not vote and could not hold office had built a national network of clubs that raised money, drafted legislation, lobbied state houses, and ran libraries, kindergartens, and public health campaigns. The club movement was the political machine of the unenfranchised. and Margaret worked it like a professional. Watch her method, because it repeats for the rest of her life. She found capable reformers and supplied what they lacked: money, publicity, and social muscle. Her most important alliance in Denver was with Judge Ben Lindsay, a crusading young jurist who believed children should not be tried, jailed, and broken alongside adult criminals. Margaret organized fundraisers and benefit events, opened her home, and put her name and her fortune behind his cause. The result was one of the first juvenile court systems in the United States, a Denver invention that became a national model. The woman the Sacred 36 would not invite to bridge had helped build a court. She did not stop there. She raised substantial funds for the construction of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, the great Catholic Church rising in the heart of a city that had sneered at her religion. She supported St. Joseph's Hospital. She staged elaborate fundraising carnivals that drew the very crowds whose hostesses excluded her. Each project was a brick in a structure Denver could not take away from her, because Denver had not given it to her. Then she did something that almost no society matron of her generation dared. She went back to school. Beginning around 1901, in her 30s, Margaret studied literature, drama, and languages at the Carnegie Institute in New York. She worked at French, German, and Italian until she could hold her own in each, and popular accounts credited her with 5 languages. She travelled through Europe, through India, through Egypt, collecting the education that Hannibal had never been able to give her. The tobacco factory girl was deliberately, methodically, building herself into a woman of the world. The contrast with her image could not have been sharper. Later, legend would paint her as a loud, unlettered clown who blundered into high society. The documented woman was a multilingual operator who funded institutions, worked legislators, and ran charitable campaigns with the discipline of a banker. Denver's inner circle saw the Irish accent and missed the architecture going up behind it. By the early 1900s, Margaret Brown had built a public life that needed no one's permission. The next thing she reached for was the one kind of power no American woman had ever been allowed to hold. Chapter 6. Running for Office. Without a vote. Colorado let women vote in 1893, and Margaret Brown decided voting was not enough. The timing of her life kept handing her openings, and she kept taking them. In November 1893, the same autumn the Little Jonny began shipping gold, the men of Colorado voted in a referendum to enfranchise the state's women. It was the first time in American history that a state's male voters had chosen to share the ballot. Wyoming had granted suffrage earlier by legislative act, but Colorado's victory came at the polls, won by exactly the kind of organizing Margaret had practiced in Leadville. She had campaigned for that cause as a poor woman. She now intended to use it as a rich one. Around 1901, she explored a run for the Colorado State Senate, an almost unheard-of ambition for a woman anywhere in the world. She stepped back from that race, but the appetite never left her. In 1914, she went further and announced a campaign for the United States Senate itself, 6 years before American women as a whole could even vote for the office she sought. The records on her candidacies are imperfect, and the campaigns were launched rather than finished. But the point was unmistakable. Margaret Brown believed a woman's place was on the ballot, and she said so with her own name. Every step of that public life came with a private bill, and the bill arrived at home. J.J. Brown had married a spirited Leadville shopgirl. He found himself, 20 years on, married to a public figure who studied in New York, summered with Eastern millionaires, gave interviews, and championed causes that made his business associates wince. He hated the attention. She refused to shrink. The marriage that had begun with a love match in a mountain church strained, cracked, and finally came apart. In 1909, after 23 years, Margaret and JJ signed a private separation agreement. As devout Catholics, they never divorced, and by most accounts they never stopped caring for each other. But they would never live together again. The settlement tells you what freedom cost and what it bought. Margaret kept the house at 1340 Pennsylvania Street and received a monthly allowance commonly reported at $700, a comfortable income in 1909, enough to fund travel, causes, and campaigns. At 42, she was something almost unknown in her generation, a woman with money, mobility, and no man to answer to, Denver society whispered. She booked passage. For the next 3 years, she moved through the world the Sacred 36 only read about, wintering abroad, working her causes, crossing the Atlantic again and again. In the early spring of 1912, she was in Egypt, traveling with John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men alive, and his young wife. Then a telegram reached her from home. Her grandson was ill. She booked the fastest passage available on a brand new ship making its first crossing. The ship was called Titanic. Chapter 7. 4 days on the Ship of Dreams. She boarded the largest ship ever built because of a telegram about a sick grandson. On April 10, 1912, Margaret Brown came aboard the Titanic at Cherbourg, France, a first-class passenger on a ticket costing roughly £27. The ship was the wonder of the age, nearly 900 feet of steel, the largest moving object human beings had ever made, carrying around 2,224 passengers and crew toward New York. The newspapers called it practically unsinkable. The word would follow her for the rest of her life, and beyond it. First class on the Titanic was the Gilded Age afloat. Astors, Guggenheims, Strausses, the cream of the world. Margaret had fought her way toward for 20 years. And notice the quiet victory in the passenger list itself. The woman Denver's inner circle had blackballed was crossing the Atlantic in the company of John Jacob Astor. The Sacred 36 guarded a parlor in Denver. Margaret Brown dined with the richest family in America in the middle of the ocean. The doors that had stayed shut at home had simply stopped mattering. For 4 days, the crossing was flawless. Margaret read, walked the decks, and talked her way through the first-class roster in 3 languages. The ship ran fast through calm, freezing seas, ignoring ice warnings that crackled in over the wireless from other vessels. The North Atlantic in April was a field of drifting ice, and the Titanic was driving into it at better than 20 knots, her owners eager for a swift maiden crossing. At 11:40 on the night of April 14th, the lookouts saw the iceberg too late. The ship swung, the ice ground along her starboard side, and the sea began pouring into compartments that the designers had believed could never flood together. Margaret, in her stateroom, felt a jolt and went to investigate. The early minutes were calm to the point of absurdity. Stewards reassured passengers. The band assembled. Few aboard understood what the ship's own builder, walking the damage below, already knew. The unsinkable ship had about 2 hours to live, and there were lifeboats for barely half the people aboard. Margaret did what she always did in a crisis. She went to work. Survivor accounts describe her helping other women into lifeboats, translating, calming, steadying. She seems to have given little thought to leaving herself. Then, as Lifeboat No. 6 hung in its davits, loading women and children, someone decided the matter for her. A crewman or fellow passenger simply seized her and dropped her several feet down into the boat as it began to lower. The boat had seats for 65 people. It left the ship with roughly 2 dozen, and the man placed in command of it was about to become the second worst thing to happen to those women that night. Chapter 8. The mutiny in Lifeboat No. 6. The man in charge of the lifeboat would not row, would not return, and would not stop predicting their deaths. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens had been at the ship's wheel when the iceberg struck. Now he sat at the tiller of Lifeboat No. 6, and as the boat pulled away into the dark, something in him gave way. The survivors' accounts describe a man frozen by dread, clinging to the rudder, issuing orders he would not explain, and refusing every appeal made to him. At 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic broke apart and went down, and the sound that followed was the worst any survivor ever described. Hundreds of people in 28-degree water calling for help. Lifeboat No. 6 had room for some 40 more. The women begged Hitchens to go back. He refused. The boat would be swamped, he said. The dying would drag them under. There was nothing left out there, he told them, but bodies. The boat drifted, half empty, while the cries faded. Margaret Brown decided she had heard enough. The cold was now the killer in the boat itself, women in nightclothes in air far below freezing. She put oars into their hands, not only to move the boat, but to keep their blood moving, and she stripped off her furs and wrapped them around the women who had the least. She organized the rowing, set the rhythm, and took an oar herself, a 44-year-old millionairess pulling on the North Atlantic in the dark. Hitchens objected. He ordered the women to stop. He warned again and again that they were all going to die, that rescue was a fantasy, that no ship was coming. The confrontation that followed became one of the most famous moments of the disaster. By the testimony of those in the boat, Margaret rose, faced him down, and told him that if he interfered, she would throw him over the side. Major Arthur Puchin, the other able man aboard, backed her. The exact words vary from account to account, as such words always do, but the outcome does not. Hitchens retreated into silence at the tiller. The women rowed. Command of Lifeboat No. 6 had changed hands without a single rule of the sea being consulted. Understand what had actually happened in that boat. Every structure of authority the era recognized, the uniform, the maritime law, the male officer's word, sat with Robert Hitchens. Margaret Brown held no rank and no right anyone would recognize in a courtroom. She took charge anyway, because the alternative was watching women freeze while a frightened man recited their doom. It was the Sacred 36 all over again. A closed door defended by someone whose only real power was the claim that things must be done his way. She had been ignoring that claim her whole life. Toward dawn, a light appeared on the horizon, and it was moving toward them. Chapter 9. The rescue ship became her headquarters. Before the Carpathia reached New York, Margaret Brown had already raised nearly $10,000 from the survivors of a shipwreck. The light on the horizon was the Cunard liner Carpathia, whose captain, Arthur Rostron, had turned his ship and driven her through the ice field at full speed the moment the distress call came in. Through the morning of April 15th, the lifeboats came alongside, and some 712 survivors climbed or were lifted aboard, out of around 2,224 who had sailed. More than 1,500 people were gone. The Carpathia was a modest ship, suddenly carrying the survivors of the largest maritime disaster in history. Hundreds of steerage passengers had lost everything: husbands, fathers, money, papers, and every possession they owned, with immigrant families landing in a strange country in borrowed clothes. The ship's crew could feed and shelter them. Nobody was organized to do more. And here is where Margaret Brown's whole life converged on 4 days at sea. She had languages, and most of the wealthy survivors did not. She moved through the rescued steerage passengers, speaking French, German, and Italian, taking names, hearing needs, making lists. She had spent 20 years extracting money from rich people for good causes, and the Carpathia happened to be carrying some of the richest people alive. Before the ship reached New York on the night of April 18th, Margaret had formed a survivors committee, installed herself at the head of it, and raised close to $10,000 in pledges from first-class survivors to support the destitute. Widows would land in New York with cash in hand because one woman had refused to spend the voyage grieving quietly. The committee did not dissolve at the pier. Margaret kept it alive, kept raising money, and the following month, in late May 1912, she stood aboard the Carpathia again and presented Captain Rostron with a silver loving cup and medals to his crew on behalf of the survivors. The photographs of that ceremony went around the world. So did her interviews. Asked to explain her survival, she gave reporters the kind of line that made editors love her, crediting typical Brown family luck. The papers improved the story with every retelling, as papers do, and the legend began assembling itself while the woman was still very much alive. Measure the reversal. For nearly 2 decades, Denver's inner circle had treated Margaret Brown as a person who did not belong in polite rooms. In April 1912, she became, for a season, the most celebrated woman in America, praised by the very newspapers her city's elite read at breakfast. Louise Hill's parlor still held 36 chairs. Margaret Brown now held the front page. She understood precisely what that was worth, and she said so out loud. The reporters would print whatever she said now. So she intended to say things that mattered. Chapter 10. She answered Ludlow before the politicians did. 2 years after the Titanic, children suffocated under a burning tent colony in southern Colorado, and Margaret Brown went to work. On April 20th, 1914, at Ludlow, Colorado, National Guard troops and mine guards attacked a tent colony of striking coal miners and their families, workers of the Rockefeller-controlled Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The tents burned. Roughly 24 people died, among them 11 children and 2 women who suffocated in a pit dug beneath a burning tent. The Ludlow Massacre became one of the darkest days in American labor history. Margaret Brown was a mining millionaire's wife. Her entire fortune had come out of Colorado rock. By every rule of class loyalty, she should have stayed silent. Instead, she organized relief for the miners' families, supplying nurses, food, clothing, and shoes. And she publicly pressed for mediation between the strikers and the operators. She had been a miner's neighbor before she was a millionaire, and when the two identities collided, she chose the soup kitchen over the boardroom. The men who ran Colorado took note, and not kindly. That same year, she announced her run for the United States Senate, and she joined Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, one of the great bankrollers of American suffrage, in organizing a women's rights conference at Belmont's Marble House Mansion in Newport. Newport was the summer capital of the Eastern aristocracy, the most exclusive resort in America. The woman Denver had blackballed was now organizing on the lawns of the grandest house in Rhode Island. The Senate campaign was set aside as war broke out in Europe and family duties pressed, but the pattern held. Every door that closed, she replaced with a bigger one. When the United States entered the First World War, she went further than speeches. She worked with the American Committee for Devastated France, supporting relief and rebuilding in regions wrecked by the fighting and helping wounded soldiers. Years later, in 1932, France would award her the Legion of Honor, recognizing the war work, the Titanic service, and the lifetime of activism behind them. The tobacco factory girl from Hannibal had been decorated by the French Republic. But while the public honors accumulated, the private accounts were falling into ruin, and the next blow came from inside her own family. Chapter 11. The Fortune That Tore Her Family Apart. J.J. Brown died without a will, and the family the gold had lifted spent 5 years fighting over what was left. He died in September 1922, and the separation that had never become a divorce now became a legal labyrinth. Margaret was still his wife. Lawrence and Helen were his heirs. With no will to settle the question, mother and children went to court against one another, and the fight ground on for roughly 5 years before a settlement in 1926. The cruelest discovery was the size of the prize. The estate of the man whose strike had shipped 135 tons of gold ore a day was appraised at about $238,000, a fraction of the fortune at its height, eroded by years of spending, speculation, and decline. Margaret's share was commonly reported at around $20,000 in cash and securities, plus income from a trust. The numbers tell the quiet story underneath the legend. The Brown fortune, like the marriage, like the family, had been coming apart for years. The litigation cost her something money cannot measure. Her relationship with her children, especially Helen, who had long been embarrassed by her mother's flamboyance, never fully recovered. So Margaret, now in her late 50s, did what she had always done with rejection. She turned it into a stage. Literally. She pursued the dream that Denver had found most ridiculous of all, an acting career, studying and performing in tribute to the great French actress Sarah Bernhardt, whose dramatic style she adored. She split her years between Paris and New York, living in hotels, giving the occasional grand interview, still good copy to the end. The money was thin, but the nerve never was. On October 26, 1932, at the Barbizon Hotel in New York, a residence for ambitious women in the arts, Margaret Tobin Brown died in her sleep at 65. The autopsy found a brain tumor, which may explain the symptoms that had troubled her final years. She was buried beside JJ at the Cemetery of the Holyrood in Westbury, New York, after a modest funeral. The woman was gone. And almost immediately, something strange began to happen to her story. Within a year, a journalist with a gift for invention would hand her a new name, and the real Margaret Brown would begin to disappear. Chapter 12. They named her Unsinkable after she died. The most famous thing about Molly Brown, including the name Molly itself, was invented after she was buried. In her lifetime, she was Margaret, or Maggie. Nobody called her Molly. The year after her death, the journalist Jean Fowler published a wildly colourful, heavily fictionalized account of her life, and the character of the unsinkable Molly Brown was born. A comic, barely lettered frontier woman who crashed society with a heart of gold and a voice like a train whistle. Later, writers embroidered the legend further. In 1960, Meredith Willson turned it into a Broadway musical, and in 1964, Hollywood released the film version starring Debbie Reynolds. The legend was complete, and the woman inside it was gone. Consider everything the legend erased. The multilingual student of the Carnegie Institute, the fundraiser who helped build one of America's first juvenile courts, the organizer who raised nearly $10,000 on a rescue ship in 4 days, the relief worker of Ludlow and devastated France, the Senate candidate, the Legion of Honor. American Memory took one of the most effective female operators of her era and filed her under comedy, because a funny woman is easier to love than a powerful one. The recovery took decades, and it started with a house. In 1970, the mansion at 1340 Pennsylvania Street faced demolition, and Denver citizens founded the preservation group Historic Denver in large part to save it. Today, it is the Molly Brown House Museum, and tens of thousands of visitors walk its rooms every year. Modern historians, above all her biographer Kristen Iverson, have stripped the varnish off the legend and found someone far more interesting underneath. Not a clown who got lucky, but a strategist who got even. So return, one last time, to the question her whole life answered. When society tells a woman she does not belong, who decides what she becomes? Louise Hill had 36 chairs and the power to keep one woman out of them. That is what her power amounted to, and it is the only reason history remembers her at all. Margaret Brown was the woman she kept out. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for an invitation. When Denver closed its doors, she built institutions Denver still uses. When the law said she could not hold office, she put her name on the ballot anyway. When a frightened man in a lifeboat told 24 freezing women to sit still and die quietly, she stood up, took the oar, and rowed. Every woman who has been told she is too loud, too new, too much. Every woman who built her own table after being refused a seat. Every woman who took charge of a sinking situation no one appointed her to fix. They are all rowing in Margaret Brown's boat. The people who told her she did not belong have been forgotten by everyone but her biographers. She is the one the world calls unsinkable. They got the name wrong, and the verdict